In this video, I'm going to be talking about how I found out my voices were voices. And of course, how I gained insight into my schizoaffective disorder as a result. If you are new here, my name is Kit and I'm diagnosed with schizoaffective disorder, which is a condition where someone experiences symptoms of schizophrenia, such as delusions and hallucinations, but also symptoms of a mood disorder, either major depression or, in my case, bipolar. And it's the hallucinations part that I'll be focusing on today because that's what the voices are. But today I want to take a few moments and talk about how I gained insight into the psychotic aspects of my illness. So sit back, grab a beverage, and let's get into it. In the very beginning, I heard one voice. I've talked about him in depth before on the channel, but I'll give a brief summary because it's been a while. And all of this started when I was 14. One night I was thinking, and the best way I can describe it is that something thought back at me. In my inner headspace, I suddenly had someone else in there with me. And surprisingly, I wasn't afraid, even though I probably should have been. This voice, who sounded male, would go on to tell me that his name was Twilight and we would become fast friends. I would talk to him all the time, as he was there all the time, and I used my own internal monologue to speak to him for the most part. And I'll talk a little bit more about how that works in a few minutes. But I became somewhat obsessed with Twilight, and in the beginning I did tell people about him. There was a running theory that maybe he was an angel, or the Holy Spirit, or the great counselor that's spoken about in the pages of the Bible, as religion was a big part of my life at this time. But while religion would go on to be to my detriment, know that at this point this voice, this character, this friend, was good. He was positive, kind and welcoming, and that's what mattered. But over time, I quit talking about the voices altogether. I just kept them to myself because Twilight was becoming less and less of an angel and more like any other person that had faults and flaws. I didn't exactly want to advertise this, so he became more of a secret the more time passed. One thing led to another, and within months of appearing, another voice appeared in my head. He went by the name of Orion, and he and Twilight did not get along. They would argue in my head, and that was not fun. And over time, Twilight became less and less at the forefront, and Orion just kind of started taking over as the dominant voice in my head. And eventually, Twilight quit talking to me at all. And so, he was replaced by this new sassy voice. Orion quickly became my new best friend, supporting me through thick and thin and helping me with, well, basically everything. He used his own brand of sarcasm and dramatic intonation to not only help me, but to make me laugh too. It wasn't a bad situation at all. And I had no idea I was hallucinating at this point, even though I had grown from having not one, but two voices in my head for a while there. Which sounds crazy, I know, that I wouldn't, well, know. But there is a key term when it comes to realizing you have a mental illness, and that word is insight. Having it is a good thing, and not having it can be challenging. And to put it plainly, when someone has insight into their illness, it means they are aware there is a problem or they know they're sick. So as you might be able to guess, a lack of insight can be a major reason why someone wouldn't be compliant with medication or treatment, because these people don't think there's a problem. That's really the basics. And so, my denial began because I didn't have full insight. I had plenty of insight about the mood side of my disorder, but the psychotic side, yeah, I had no idea. I would merely tell people that I thought in conversation, thinking that the way my brain worked was that I had characters in my head, and that those characters were part of my internal monologue, and that the conversations I had with said characters were how I thought through things. I kind of described it sometimes as the relationship that a writer might have with the characters in their book, meaning that sometimes when they're writing, their characters have a mind of their own and they kind of can have conversations, and I kind of attributed my voices to that kind of thing. And while there's a lot, inconsistent there, it was what I believed at the time, because I didn't think any of my voices were hallucinations, at all. Because even though to all of you, me telling this story, and even me now, it does seem pretty obvious, it wasn't obvious to me at the time. And so, time passed, and the friends in my head passed time with me, and I continued to make excuses for everything. But there were times when I would get a crack in my denial, when I would scour the internet searching for answers to whether or not I was hearing voices. It was a scary Google search every time. But there was one key thing that kept me in the dark. My hallucinations were internal. This means that the voices I heard were happening on the inside of my head in the same headspace as one might have thoughts or an internal monologue. But in all my Googling, I found next to nothing about these internal auditory hallucinations that I was experiencing. So with that fact, I didn't think I was hearing voices because I thought you had to hear them on the outside of your head like someone was in the room with you. And I can't really recall the details because things get kind of fuzzy sometimes, but I do recall some of the voices not being happy that I was researching them. And that kept me from doing that research many times. But I still ended up looking things up once or twice a year despite their protests. Despite Orion's protests specifically. So I had an inkling that something was up, but I didn't have enough insight to truly explore it. Another thing was that when I was in college, I had a bad mixed bipolar episode and was put on Abilify, which is an antipsychotic. And honestly, Orion and I both wondered if the medication would affect him in any way. I know. How did I not know? I just didn't. Anyways, time passed while I was on Abilify and nothing happened with my voices. And I remember Orion at one point saying, well, since the medication didn't make me go away, I guess I'm not a voice in your head after all. And that was the end of my curiosity for a while. I was back into denial, even though I talked to the voices all the time. And my posse grew from 1 to 2 to 3 by the time I graduated, and that doesn't even include Twilight, the original. But there were 2 other things that happened in college that should have tipped me off that I was experiencing psychosis. I had a friend who was a psychology student, and I actually told her about Orion. Orion was so mad at me for this. He yelled and screamed, and it was not a good time. But my friend told me voices could be internal. And that rocked my world because it was the first time that someone validated something that I desperately wanted, needed answers to. It was scary, if I was being honest. However, even with this new information, I dismissed it and went straight back into denial. Orion calmed down, I went back to my life. And I had another moment, and this moment was with a distant family member that I had no blood relation to, but was diagnosed with schizophrenia. And he and I spoke at length about inside voices and how they can happen. I even told him about mine to an extent, which once again, Orion did not like. But even with this conversation, I still didn't realize I was hallucinating and hearing voices. Wild. But little did I know that after college, the end was coming, and I would have to face and accept the facts. I moved to New York City on a partially manic whim, and promptly had a psychotic break that would traumatize me forever. My regular voices, the ones I'd been hearing for years, didn't actually get worse. They actually helped me cope with the whole situation, which was rather helpful. But I did get deeply delusional, and I had some hallucinations pop up that were new that kind of fed into those delusions. The more time went on, the deeper I fell into psychosis until I lost touch with reality. I reached a point from which I thought I'd never return. But after it went on for a while, I started having moments where I wondered if it was real. I was starting to doubt my reality a bit, because the things I was experiencing were starting to not make sense. And at the time, to me, the psychosis I was experiencing did make sense, even if looking back on it, it made no sense at all. But this new lack of sense that I was experiencing at this point in the episode had me questioning everything. And it was terrifying. I cannot express how terrifying it was. I was experiencing a lot of religious delusions primarily, and the psychosis wasn't lining up with what I knew about religion anymore. So that was the crack that changed everything. And so I started freely Googling psychosis and what it was like. How people with bipolar disorder, which was my diagnosis at the time, can experience it. All the while I'm still off the rails and experiencing so many awful symptoms. I had this one moment where I remember thinking this thought so clearly. And I've censored this for YouTube, but the thought was, if this is real, I'm screwed. And if it's not real, I'm screwed. Both of them were equally terrible at the time. It was that bad. But with this realization that what I was experiencing might not be real, I started wondering about my experiences with these friends in my head. And maybe they weren't real too. My doubts ended up being what pushed me to get help for it. Help for all of it. And so on a broken prayer, I called my doctor and told him all the stuff that made me feel so bonkers. The voices, the delusions, the mania, and the depression. Because when I made that call, I knew it wasn't real. And there was no going back. I heard voices all the time. I hallucinated constantly. And that was my reality. This whole time, the entire time, ever since I was 14, it wasn't real. They weren't thoughts. They weren't characters. I didn't think in conversation. I just had a psychotic disorder and heard voices. And so I went on meds for all of it. I wish I could have kept Orion and the others. But at the end of the day, it all had to go in order to pave the way for me to live a better life. And so I'll end this video by telling you that I sobbed my heart out the night before I took my first dose of Zyprexa. Because we all knew it was the end, Orion especially. We knew it was over. And really, it was a good run. There were lots of good times. And it was time to move on. And so I did. My psychotic break changed my life, and it made me lose my friends. It was very clearly a before and after moment for me. But I got through it and came out the other side and got stable, and that's what matters. And that's how I gained insight into my schizoaffective disorder and learned that my voices were voices. I know it's weird to have the person who's experiencing psychosis figure out that they're experiencing psychosis, but that was me. I've always been very self-aware, and this is just evidence of that, even if I was in denial for nearly a decade. And now I want to ask you a question. If you too have a psychotic disorder or some other mental disorder, how did you gain insight into your condition? Did you figure it out? Did someone else figure it out for you? Let me know in the comment section down below, as I would love to hear your thoughts. But other than that, thanks so much for joining me and making the uncomfortable comfortable yet again. Subscribe if you haven't already, and I'll see you in the next one.